full of food while you're eating away. For your viewing pleasure next, we have my good friend, Mr. Maneesh Mehta. Maneesh is another very experienced business professional. Right now, he co-founded the Black Box Institute. Prior to that, he spent 19 years at Deloitte, one of the largest professional services organizations in the world. Had a number of senior positions at Deloitte, including partner. And his advisory services are focused on M&A strategy, due diligence, to private equity and strategic buyers. Served in many senior level positions, including Deputy Managing Partner of Clients and Markets, Chief Marketing Officer, and Deputy Managing Partner of the Global Emerging Strategic Clients Program, which focused on growth organizations. He's also done a lot of writing, and he's also a terrific guy. I present to you Mr. Maneesh Mehta is going to talk to you about pricing.
Thank you, Peter. I'll have to be more careful about which bio I send out next time. Thank you very much for having me. And even though we've already had a little introduction on pricing, my topic is really on pricing. And what I hope to present to you today is a very fast thumbnail overview of some basics on pricing. And these slides are a compilation from various textbooks and other sources, but I think you can get all sorts of information online on pricing. With one exception, and the one exception is that I do have a good friend and a client who actually runs a pricing consultancy, and I actually asked him to come and speak to you more than me today. Unfortunately, his schedule didn't permit that, but I did have a chance to speak to him, and he did send me some of his thoughts. So what I will try to do is I'll try to convey some of the insights from his vast experience. He spends his entire sort of career advising companies on how to price and what are the aspects of pricing. So what I will try to do is, as Peter's mentioned, my background is really in the area of advisory services. I'll try to give you some experience or some insights from my experience. I sit on a couple of other boards. We're going through some very interesting pricing decisions as we speak, and if that comes up, maybe we can have some dialogue there as well. So hopefully by the time we get through this presentation, you'll have a little bit more grounding on some of these topics. But I think the core, in simple terms, the core equation that I will talk around today really rests on the 3 C's of pricing. And the 3 C's are customer, cost, and competition. And pricing is determined by these 3 factors. So cost determines your floor price. In the previous example, there were 5 pricing strategies, and it implied that you can set your price based on cost in some cases. But to do pricing appropriately, you have to your cost actually sets your floor price. Your customer, in fact, sets your ceiling price. The price that you can charge is really what the customer is willing to pay. And your competition, and again, that's the value piece. So this word value is going to come up quite a bit in this presentation. And then the price you actually charge in the floor and the ceiling is determined by your competition. And that's where various discounts and marketplace acceptance and context play. So that's fairly straightforward. Cost sets your floor price, the customer sets your ceiling price, and depending on the degree of competition at the moment, you have to decide where you are between the floor and the ceiling, and this assumes that your ceiling is higher than your floor. You don't want to be the other way around. The tricky part, of course, is how many people know their costs really well. How many people know their customer and their ability to pay for your product really well? How many people have a really good handle on what the competition is going to do as you put the price to market? And I would say that in my years of trying to sell professional services, all three of those dimensions have been fuzzy at best. In retrospect, I mean, when you go for a bid, you don't know any of these things, no matter how many times you look for that. In retrospect, more often than not, you realize you could have actually charged a higher price. And despite the years of realizing that, the next time that RFP comes out, you still don't know any of those equations. And so what I will do as we go through this is just elaborate on that simple but hard to grasp equation. So again, we'll go through this very quickly, but price is what you pay for what you get, and there's lots of different terms for different sectors. The issue, I'll keep repeating this, is what is the demand value curve for your customer? We don't know. I sit on the board of a school. We're going through, yet again, our annual tuition fee increase. We do this every year, we're doing it for 30 years. We don't know our demand value curve for the customers that we have. It's a guess every single time. Part of it may be an art form, but I think for your businesses, the more effort you can put into it trying to understand that, even intuitively, the better you'll be able to price. So what do we mean by price? There's some definitions around base price, expected price, and so forth. The key word on this slide that I want to emphasize for you is value. What is the value? And this is another notion. We talk about adding value, providing value, trying to determine what you perceive as a value versus what the customer perceives as a value. Again, is part of the art of pricing. So the previous speaker mentioned that pricing was about context, and that's what it says, that price often depends on the circumstances. And in different situations, you're willing to pay a lot. In other situations, not as much. And so you have different phenomena. You have prices, products that are priced at a premium. And the current example of that everybody uses is anything dealing with Apple products. And there are other examples on the other extreme where you have internet sites where you can get spot pricing, very steep discounts for anything that is time sensitive, so hotels or airplane seats or all sorts of things. I guess Groupon is a big phenomenon. So anyways, we'll try to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So as you think about pricing, one of the things you should think about is what's your objective with it. And again, we've talked about some of these notions or concepts. Cost plus, based on demand cost, based just on the marketplace. And once you set your objective, you come down to different strategies. And this is just a very brief selection of them. There's all sorts of different strategies. You have to go through your particular situation in your industry and your company to try to determine this. Let me just give you one example, an extreme example. Here's an ad. I don't know if you can see it. It's by IKEA, where they actually go to the extreme. They actually set the price and design their whole value chain for that particular product to make that price. Now, I don't know how they've determined this, but that's one way of growing a business. What is the price that you think that your market will bear? What price do you want to operate at on that demand value curve? And that leads to these two, again, in simple terms, two basic paradigms. Cost-based, where you start with the product and you get to the customer, or value-based, where you sort of try to understand what the customer is going to pay for and work back to what you have to do to get that product manufactured and delivered to the customer. So in pricing objectives, again, from what you'll see here are some of the factors you need to take into account. What are your objectives in terms of profit? Of course, we've had a discussion on maximizing cash flow, but I mean, around at some point you have to sort of say what are your profit targets? Are you trying to stimulate sales? Are you trying to maintain status quo? Are you trying to preserve? Are you being reactive? Are you being proactive? Are you meeting some competitive threat? Are you being opportunistic? These are all things to keep in mind. And the other thing and this is a pricing discussion, but again, it's rarely done in isolation. It really has to be done in the context of your complete marketing mix. And in the discussions that, or the experience I've had, I think I'm guilty of often relying too heavily on pricing and discounting to carry the load and not doing enough on determining what's the value, how do I convey the value, or how do I position myself and place my particular service. Some of the factors that affect price, and I said this at the outset, how elastic is the demand for your product? Yeah, I've never done it. I've lost bids that have priced very aggressively, and the client has gone for a brand. And in other cases, I've won because I have had the brand, despite the fact that they are lower price products. Sometimes I've guessed right, and other times I've guessed wrong. And when we have the Q&A, there's a couple of gentlemen here who I think have similar experience, and you can ask their opinions on what they do to determine how to price. Part of it depends on how busy is your shop. In our business, if you're not busy, you can get very aggressive, or you're too busy, and then you get very inelastic with your price. Related to this is, hey, what's the demand? So in classical product terms, if you lower your price, you will stimulate demand. But by how much? Well, we are doing a project right now where we're trying to estimate demand for travelers in an emerging market for the next 15 years. How do you determine that? And I think we all in business have to forecast and estimate demand. It has its own competencies, capabilities. Again, you have to, this is really the trick. Even in the school that we're trying to determine the fee increase, what's the demand going to be? And there's an enormous fear factor that demand is going to plummet. So even if you had complete objective analytical data, the other part of the equation, and I haven't actually included this in this discussion, but there's a whole body of knowledge on of ensuring you have appropriate process. In our case, we have to actually corral a decision-making body, and where every member has to feel confident about the demand. So your price is determined often by the person who feels the most skittish in that group. And a lot of the work that Paul does, I know, is actually setting and putting in place rigorous processes in an organization to make sure that you can actually price your products appropriately. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but these are some analytics about price, value, demand equation. There's another whole dimension around making sure that the people that you're working with feel equivalently confident about the direction that you're heading in, both in estimating demand, having a good sense of the competition, having a good sense of your customers, and therefore where you want to price, assuming you also have agreement on the right strategy for pricing. If you are able to understand cost and the demand, sometimes they're not as relevant as just being purely competitively based. So in an RFP type of a setting, you're really thinking about the competition and whether you want to win that particular bid, how many people are competing for that bid. And so in this case, the competitive factors almost entirely determine pricing. We had a little discussion about the model of free, and maybe we can have some Q&A on that. I don't know. My experience is that once you set something free, really low, it's very difficult to lift price. That's been my experience, and Alex is nodding. It's very difficult to lift the price once you set it. So I'm not sure about the long-term success of some of the free models, but it's very difficult to go back the other way. So if you're going to attach other revenue-producing services around a free thing, you really need to be sure and apply all of these principles that we're talking about to those other things that you've attached yourself to. So another dimension is segmentation. So we know about segmentation, we know about market segmentation, and of course the price dimension of that also has segmentation. Again, this is a very simple overview of one way of looking at segmenting your customers by price. And the point here is you should look carefully and try to analyze who are you actually trying to target? Who is the market? I should have mentioned this even on the competition. I think we have a tendency to broaden how many people we think we're competing against, and we also have a tendency to broaden how many customers we're trying to attract. I think if you can have the discipline to narrow some of those, it can help make things clearer and helping you set your price. So I'm going to go through about 5 challenges. A lot of these come from Paul at Pricing Solutions. The first one he talks about getting a 1% pricing mindset. And the example he uses is that if you have a 1% drop in price, assuming you have fixed variable and fixed costs, what is the impact on your profitability? So if your revenue is 100% and your costs are, I'll pick a number, 92%, your profit margin of 8%, assuming your costs remain the same, if you drop your price by 1%, what's the impact on profitability? He's going to give you a book if you have a right question, but if you get this answer, he might give you the book.
12%.
Yeah, 12.5%. And the purpose of that example is to say that you really should pay attention to price because we tend to discount without realizing the impact on profitability. The challenge is on differentiation. So this is really reinforcing value. How do you determine value? There are 2 types of value. There's hard financial value, and there's soft perceived value. And it's really the soft perceived value where the art of determining price comes from. What are the factors that go into perceived value? Well, again, fairly straightforward: product, quality, service, quality, cost, and then this brand and image. And I was telling Peter in the break that when I was at Deloitte, I could charge a certain rate per hour because I had a very big brand behind me. After I left Deloitte, I can't charge that same rate because I don't have that brand. I actually think I provide a lot more value, lower price point. How should we price? So on a relative price value curve, you want to be on the bottom right-hand side of this curve. Again, that's fairly straightforward. You're going like this is really very simple. The hard part is, do you know where that pink line is for your customer set? And I've said, I've had a difficult time, despite many years in my industry, trying to determine exactly where that is. If you have a very good idea, you can get a huge competitive advantage in your pricing. So the challenge is, where's that curve for your customer? And even if you know, it shifts as you know. That's right.
If you're first to market, you can determine the price.
Right.
Okay, and something else occurred. Sorry, there was something else. If you're first to market, you do get a chance to set the price.
Yeah. And this is free.
Well, that's the price.
Yeah. That's right. So, and I'm gonna go to this slide, but we're gonna talk about, again, our favorite example of first to market, which is in the last decade or so, many products has been Apple. So they have actually set the price. Other people discounted that price for obvious reasons. And if you follow, say, the iPhone example, and what Apple has done, again, these are segments and different characteristics of segments based on price. And again, on each one of these, we could have long working sessions. But for tonight, the point I want to make is start with your loyal base. And this is what Apple did. And then they migrated to the value column. And what they've done so well, and the reason they've had such sustained success, is that they've been able to stay in that column by continually bringing up products that are adding value. And we've all seen it and experienced and bought their product. And we can go through a lot of examples where companies have failed to do that. I hate to pick on any company, but if you're carrying a RIM device, you can see that that journey is not quite as consistent. They did start with their loyal secure. I mean, they were first to market. They had a very loyal following. And for a period of time, they were providing great value, but they seem to be teetering on that. Again, there's a lot of, we're only having pricing discussions, and we can have a lot of other discussion as to why that's happened. And this is, again, a dimension or a factor for you to keep in mind. I mean, who are your loyal market? Who are the ones that relate to your expertise? Who are the ones that value price in terms of segment? And really, what you want are the ones that appreciate the value that you provide. That goes to my earlier comment. If you have too broad a customer base, you're going to get confused. And it takes, in my experience, takes enormous discipline within your group to sort of get an agreement on who are the customers actually value. You'll get a lot of disagreement. Some of that will be right, some of that won't be, but it's trying to get that agreement, that's the challenge. And I finished this particular section just to say, we know this intuitively. The market knows what's fair. You know that. You know that as consumers. You kind of know where the lay of the land, whether it's cars or computers or whatever it is you want to get, or clothing. You kind of know what's fair, and you spot very quickly when you're trying not to be fair. In some cases where there are monopoly effects, you can try to extract some value, but even there, our telecom providers, consumers complain because they perceive that there's a degree of unfairness going on in the price, and they go to the regulator. So keep that in mind, and this actually is a setup in a couple of slides to say one of the things Paul recommends is try to be a good ambassador. Try not to either have predatory pricing or on either end, and because that hurts the industry, it hurts, I think, eventually you as a company in the long run. Before we get to that, another challenge is do a little bit of psychology or psychological analysis. We have a tendency to assume our customers are rational, and we should know, just to do a little bit of introspection, that not all of them are. And two very quick illustrations, and there are many other ones. One is, this is a quick survey of people on pricing recall. The price was $8.50. There's a distribution of what price they recalled. So what the message is, what you're trying to transmit in terms of price is not, don't assume that it's being received the way you're transmitting it, because there's noise in the system. And the other, I guess, aspect of this is think of some remedies. And we are bombarded with these examples all the time in newspapers. Here's some examples of poor ways to frame pricing, and on the right, some good ways to frame it. And it's easier to read, easier to understand, more enticing, gets you to buy the product. There's many more, but depending again on the context of the situation for your particular product. And the fourth one, this is coming up to the predatory pricing discussion, is avoid fear-based pricing. And I would say to you that I have not done that many times. It's very difficult to not be fearful of what you think the competitor is going to do. You certainly don't want to lose because you've overpriced, so you tend to underprice. And I would say historically, my experience is I've left a lot of money on the table because I've been poor at all of these things. You take, again, maybe overusing Apple, you take Apple and you can tell these guys are brilliant at pricing. They charge a premium. They don't charge that much of another example, a company that comes to mind that I think charges too much of a premium is Bose, speakers. They're great speakers, but wow, their price is quite a bit higher. Apple prices are higher, but not quite enough. So their profitability is huge. Tons of people are buying them, even though they are somewhat higher than the PCs. And over time, they have continued to add value and maintain that pricing relative to their customers. So that was I couldn't remember the word, but that was the word, is be a pricing diplomat. So follow some elements of excellence in pricing, try to avoid price wars. Now, I think it's a little ironic, this quote from Ted Rogers, because I think it's a little ironic that he's talking about this because his company seems to be one of the highest priced companies, but anyways, so try to be a pricing diplomat. I thought that was a very good phrase, which I still recall. And use called nuanced thinking. So think about the nuances around pricing and maintain, relative to the marketplace and all the things we've talked about, a good price threshold. And finally, for those of you in the room that have the luxury of brand and power behind you, leverage the power that you do have. And don't be afraid. And again, I would say, in retrospect, over the years, this is probably where I have not done enough to leverage the power. The illustration here is, and this is a sort of a result of surveys, most account managers would rather have the flu than have to discuss a price increase with the customer. How many people are uncomfortable about discussing price increases even today in your particular example? Peter, I didn't point you out, but you might put your hand up. Anyways, in summary, there is a strong correlation. I mean, there's many dimensions here to pricing. There is a strong correlation in capacity utilization of pricing. If you have a lot of capacity, you're going to have an incentive to lower your price. If your utilization is really high, increase it. Try to break the paradigm based on some of the concepts that we've talked about today, to break the paradigm of saying price increases are bad. They're not, because your focus really should be on value, not on price. It's one component of value. Think about the segments that we talked about. Think about differentiation and try to understand clearly what that means for in your circumstance. I think very few people do. And remember the 3 C's which we started with, which is your customer, your competition, and your policy. Thanks very much.
Questions?
I try to find out as much as I can about what I think the customer's tolerance level is, and try to meet that.
So more volume?
Yeah, well, that is value, because what I would like to charge, what I think my service is worth, is not as relevant as what the customer thinks. So now, there is a brand effect, and Peter and Alex can talk about that. But at the end of the day, at the moment, that's what I try to do is I try to see what is the customer willing to pay. Now, if your costs are greater than what that customer is willing to pay, then either that customer is not in the right segment, you shouldn't be serving that customer. And it's hard to walk away, but you learn to do that. Or you haven't done a good enough job of explaining the value that your services want to provide. In my case, it's a service. I don't know if Alex or Peter, if you want to comment on that, please.
I think your comment about brand power and all that is quite relevant. I mean, it's a well-known fact that Sony products are about 30% more expensive than equivalent product, and sometimes actually it can be better in sound and everything else. But Sony has a brand loyalty, and they leverage and exploit that, and they charge 30% premium. Bose, as Maneesh mentioned, is another example, and theirs are more than 30%.
Well, I mean, obviously it works because they haven't gone out of business. I've never bought their product, but they're there, so they're targeting a segment that's not me. That's it.
You made the comment about increasing prices is very difficult at times. And I realize that has happened a number of times to me. And the only way I've found around that is to rebrand the newer product and put some extra benefits or something like that with that. But that allows you to then hike the price, and people do not object to that. So you keep your loyalty and you keep your brand.
So I told Lila that I started with 107 slides to cut this down. One of the slides I cut down was on tiering, on always having like three, having three sort of, silver, gold, platinum. So that's one mechanism of trying to protect your price. That's it.
I'm involved in politics. I'm running for municipal office. I've dealt and spoken to thousands of small business owners. One of the biggest challenges is advertising. So one of the things I always suggest them, why don't they look at Torstar's, WagJag, or something like Groupon as an advertising vehicle, and they sort of try to wrap their head around it, and then they're really stumped about the pricing issue. Because a substantial discount, and obviously for some businesses it's sort of tipped them over to being very successful, or it's tipped them over to being going to bankruptcy because they don't understand, for example, like the Big Butcher story that was in Ellen Osman's columns in the Toronto Star.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could sort of speak to that whole, is it disruptive or is it beneficial?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I think the Groupon experiment, I'm not sure if that's sustainable. I think a lot of people are jumping in because it's very tempting if you have a hotel room or a plane that's leaving, or other examples like that, to say, hey, I got to pay for this anyway, so my marginal cost is zero, so I can dump this. But I think it comes down to having a very clear idea of what is your value proposition, and what is, who your customers are. I go back to the 9/11. You may recall after 9/11 there was a travel, market down, and in New York in particular, you could have almost any hotel room for a very substantial discount. Our Canadian company had Four Seasons deliberately never lowered the price. They took a huge hit in volume, but they maintained their brand. So there's, I think, an extreme example where I think they have a very clear idea of where they want to be positioned. If you look at their long-term success in positioning, in the long term, people pay a huge premium to stay there, and they never actually violate that. And I think with Groupon, you have a risk of, depending on where you're positioned on the price curve, of undermining that. And it takes a long time to build that brand, and very short time to undermine it. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's maybe other people have more comments.
I just wondered more for small businesses, because I can see for big businesses there's a risk factor, but for small businesses, other than obviously they don't understand their own cost versus price, and then they start skewing themselves toward bankruptcy. is there something that they should be perceiving in terms of the value of market
Well,
price?
I think even for a small business, I think, well, I would say that, you know, what's their strategy? Where do they want to be positioned? If they're positioned, you know, in the Walmart segment, then, and that's where they want to grow, maybe that Groupon is a great example, but if they eventually want to be positioned more in the Four Seasons segment, then, and you know, this is subject to the cash flow. I'm just talking about pricing.
Any more questions? Well, Maneesh, thanks very much.